Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our colleague, Representative Chaffetz. It's good to have you here. As we begin the final weeks of this 114th Congress, the legislation before us today demonstrates that debates over public land management don't have to divide the country into ideological or regional camps. We can and must work together to ensure that our forests, our parks, our public lands continue to be managed on behalf of all Americans in a manner that reflects the federal government's important commitment to balance conservation for future generations with sustainable productivity for local communities. The Mountain Accord offers us a model for achieving these goals. Forged over the course of several years, the Mountain Accord seeks to resolve decades of land management conflicts in the central Wasatch Mountains, lands that are clearly so deeply cherished by all those who live there. The collaboration brought together a wide range of stakeholders in northern Utah, including the governor, local elected officials, ski resorts, private business owners, the Forest Service, conservationists, and local residents in order to preserve the natural, recreational, and economic value of the central Wasatch Range for future generations. The legislation before us today, H.R. 5718, is just one piece of this overall agreement, but is critical to the Accord's overall success. This legislation can be perfected, but it represents a locally driven, consensus-based agreement that strengthens management of our public lands, fosters their multi-use mandate, and benefits the people who rely on them for economic livelihoods. Stakeholders on the ground are now working towards approval and implementation of the Accord, but it cannot be achieved without assistance from Congress. H.R. 5718 begins that process. The legislation establishes the Central Wasatch National Conservation and Recreation Area, which will provide permanent protection to nearly 80,000 acres of existing federal land, including designation of approximately 8,000 acres of new wilderness areas, acknowledging an important understanding that we must balance the pressures of population growth and increased tourism with permanent, lasting conservation. I am glad to see my colleague, Chairman Chaffetz, affirming his support for wilderness, and I want to thank both Chairman Bishop and Subcommittee Chairman McClintock for bringing this legislation before us. These new designations will protect important water resources, promote long-term conservation, and ensure that the many backcountry skiers, hikers, and those simply seeking solitude can continue to enjoy these public lands. They are certainly most beautiful. The bill also removes a small section of wilderness to assist in the completion of a popular multi-use trail and authorizes land exchanges between the Forest Service and several ski resorts, which are key drivers of the local tourism economy. The land exchanges authorized in the bill will protect vital watersheds and preserve recreation access on public lands and promote certainty and clarity to ski resorts for future development. I also hope that our hearing today encourages this committee to consider other pieces of legislation that similarly reflect locally driven consensus agreements to prove protections for our public lands and provide benefits to local communities that surround them. Over a year and a half ago, Representative Capps introduced H.R. 1865, the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, and shortly afterwards, Representative Polis introduced H.R. 2554, the Continental Divide Wilderness and Recreation Act. Neither of these bills add additional land to the federal estate or increase costs to the federal government. Much like the Mountain Accord, they reflect the will of local stakeholders who want to provide lasting protections for these treasured public lands. They have earned the right to be considered as well and debated by this committee. I will thank our future witnesses. I thank you here, Representative Chaffetz. I know that you, like many others, you always travel across this country to be with us today, but our those future witnesses also are doing that today, and I look forward to hearing their testimony and hearing how the federal government can continue to be an engaged stakeholder in the successful implementation of the Mountain Accord. Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chaffetz. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have a question. I just want to commend you and the 200 stakeholders who came together. I think as we're hearing from our chairman, these issues certainly were not simple, and I think people brought very strong feelings about the best way forward, but you came up with an agreement that reflected the interests of the many stakeholders, and I commend you. I think it does achieve some balance. It reflects the federal government's commitment to balance conservation. That is our mandate. We have a multi-use mandate that recognizes there are a multitude of uses for our federal lands, and that's a commitment we make in order to protect these lands for all Americans for many generations, but we also know we have to find a way forward with sustainable economic activity. And as you've referenced, the many people who come for skiing, I, for one, I've never skied on our New England slopes, but I hear they're tougher than all those beautiful slopes you have out there. Quite a different undertaking, but I know how beautiful they are. And then you referenced the 5.7 million people who come in the non-ski season. So obviously, the conservation of those great public lands is a very important draw, one way or the other, whether you're making your way through them to go to the skiing resorts or just simply to enjoy them in and of themselves. And I appreciate that recognition that has taken place in this Mountain Accord, the ways in which the stakeholders understood everybody had to give up something, but everybody also got something out of it that they perceived to be of great value. And I think it reflects that understanding that we do have to move, as we move forward with population growth, have to bring balance to these efforts so that we can promote sustainable, as I said, economic activity in the region while protecting these tremendously beautiful lands for future generations. So I commend you and all the stakeholders who are part of this for bringing this legislation to us. Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I have really appreciated all your testimonies this morning, just to hear the very concerted ways in which you've all come together. I'm sure overcame many hurdles in your own little silo in order to be a part of this partnership, and it sounds to me like it's a very solid agreement that you all are deeply committed to. And I think that bodes well for the future, although, as we always know, these things are complicated and there may be some bumps in the road, but it seems to me you all are starting from a very good place. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Fisher, a question. You know, we have a real dispute about the value of wilderness areas. And in an article that you wrote, you've been quoted as saying that wilderness, quote, wilderness has been polarized in this state and across the West. But I personally believe wilderness to be the best tool for protecting the ecological integrity and wildness of a landscape, unquote. And I certainly agree with that. But can you talk about why the wilderness designations are so important in this bill? And also, as we think about it, they are for the American people. They represent a commitment that these lands are for all of us to be protected for future generations. So if you could just talk about that one piece of this compromise.